I hid $400 million in assets from my parents and siblings that I earned by selling software online because I knew my family was very greedy, and one day, when my parents insulted me at a family gathering, I left home. I knew they thought I would come back and beg them, but when they saw me on TV for an interview as a youngest millionaire. So, they were shocked. I grew up in a two-story gray house on the quiet edge of Dayton, Ohio, a place where the lawns were always trimmed in straight lines and people cared more about Sunday appearances than weekday kindness. The house itself looked harmless, a slanted roof, a porch that creaked under the slightest pressure, and a yard that my father insisted he would fix up one day, but never touched. To outsiders, it probably looked like any other house in that American neighborhood. To me, it felt like a small box I had been squeezed into, a place where I learned early that love always came with conditions and expectations. Inside that house lived my parents, Mark and Denise, my older sister Emily, my younger brother Lucas, and me, Janice Parker, the child who never quite fit into the picture they liked to show the world. My parents had a secret obsession with status. They watched people carefully, always comparing, always measuring. If someone down the street bought a new car, my father would spend the evening criticizing the purchase, pretending he didn't care. But the next day, he'd talk about how he deserved something nicer too. Money wasn't just money in that house. It was a tool, a ranking system, a way to decide who mattered. My father often sat at the kitchen table with the evening news flickering behind him on the old television. Whenever a story came on about a rich entrepreneur, a successful athlete, or someone who had made it, he would lean back, cross his arms, and say, "Some people are born winners, and some people just float around wasting time." He didn't point at me when he said it, but he didn't have to. His eyes always drifted in my direction, telling me exactly where he thought I belonged in that sentence. My mother, on the other hand, didn't bother with indirect hints. She cared deeply, almost painfully, about how we looked to our neighbors. If I wore the same hoodie twice in the same week, she'd wrinkle her nose and say, "Janice, no one respects a girl who doesn't care about her appearance." If my hair wasn't perfect, she'd comment on it the moment I stepped into the room. She saved her praise for Emily, who knew exactly how to act, exactly how to dress, and exactly how to impress the mothers and daughters on our street. Emily liked attention. She always had. She talked openly about wanting to marry a wealthy man one day and live in a big house in some other American city like Charlotte, Phoenix, or Denver. My parents loved that. They'd smile and say, "That's our girl," as if she had already won some invisible prize. Lucas, the youngest, quickly learned that if he talked about becoming a doctor or a businessman, he'd get rewarded too. My parents adored anything that sounded impressive. I was the odd one. I didn't dream about fancy houses or rich husbands. I liked quiet things, drawing, reading, and later, something that changed everything: coding. When I was 13, my uncle Robert visited from Columbus and gave us his old laptop because he had upgraded to a newer one for work. It was slow, heavy, and scratched, but the moment I opened it, I felt like someone had handed me a key. The screen had a crack in the corner, and the N key was missing, but it had internet. To me, that was more valuable than anything else in that gray house. At night, after everyone had gone to bed, I would sit cross-legged on my bedroom floor with the laptop balanced on my knees. The hum of the old fan was the only sound in the room. I watched tutorials, read forums, and took free online lessons from people in America and Europe who seemed to speak a language I wanted desperately to understand. I had no teacher, no guide, no one checking my progress. But I had a feeling deep in my chest that whispered, "This could be your way out." During the day, I told no one. Whenever my mother caught a glimpse of the screen and saw lines of code, she rolled her eyes and said, "Why are you wasting your time with that? No one makes real money doing computer stuff unless they're geniuses." She didn't say the second part out loud, but the implication was clear, and you're not one. She preferred that I take an interest in things she could show off: cooking, fashion, or anything that made me look like a normal girl. My father wasn't much better. If he saw me at the kitchen table with the laptop, he'd tap the wood impatiently and say, "Shouldn't you be doing something useful?" Useful, to him, meant something that fit their expectations, not mine. He wanted achievements they could brag about on weekends to people who didn't really care. So, I learned to work in silence. I studied quietly, absorbed everything, and kept my excitement hidden. I didn't tell Emily because she would laugh. I didn't tell Lucas because he would tell our mother. And I definitely didn't tell my parents because every dream I ever mentioned in that house was either dismissed, belittled, or ignored until it disappeared. The strange part was that their doubt didn't crush me the way they expected it to. It fueled me. Every time my mother made a comment about my future, every time my father compared me to successful people on the news, I felt something inside me sharpen, like a blade being honed. I promised myself that if no one else believed in me, then I would. If no one else saw potential in me, then I would find it on my own. I remember one night clearly. I was 15, the house was silent, and a thunderstorm was rumbling in the distance. I sat on the floor with a laptop glowing softly in the dark, and I thought, one day, I'm going to build something big, something real, something that has my name on it. I didn't know how or when, but the belief settled in me like a seed planted deep underground. Everything I learned in that house, I learned alone. Every skill, every bit of knowledge, every small victory happened quietly, in the shadow of people who thought I would never amount to anything. They didn't know that while they were measuring my worth by their own narrow standards, I was slowly constructing a different kind of future, one they couldn't imagine and didn't deserve to claim. Looking back now, I realized that the gray house where I grew up didn't make me small. It only tried to. What it truly did was push me toward the life I have now. Without intending to, my family taught me the greatest lesson I could ever learn. If you want a life that belongs to you, you sometimes have to build it in secret. And that is exactly what I did. By the time I turned 19, my family had moved from Dayton to a slightly bigger house in Cleveland, Ohio. My parents described it as an upgrade, though it wasn't much different from our old place except for a red front door and a patchy yard with a dead tree my father insisted he'd cut down when he had time. He said that for 2 years, and the tree stood there like a monument to all the things he promised but never followed through on. The house had more space, but it felt just as small to me. I lived in the smallest bedroom, partly by choice, partly because my parents believed Emily needed more space for her things and Lucas needed a room that encouraged studying. By then, I was past the stage of hoping for approval. I didn't tell them much, especially not that the old laptop Uncle Robert had given us years ago still sat in my room, slow but reliable, like an old friend who never asked for anything. I had also bought myself a newer laptop. Well, newer was generous. It was a used machine I got from a guy named Nathan in a grocery store parking lot for $400. He handed it to me wrapped in a blanket from his trunk, and when I saw it actually turned on, I felt like I had won a lottery that no one else had bought a ticket for. That laptop was the real beginning of everything. I had spent years teaching myself how to code, and around 19, something clicked. I realized that all the little tools I had been building for fun, scripts, automation lines, tiny programs, could be useful to people who ran small online shops. Most of them didn't have time for tech problems. They needed simple solutions. So I built one. I spent 3 weeks working late into the night, my bedroom lights the only ones awake in the whole house. I tested it over and over, fixing errors and rewriting parts until it did exactly what I imagined. Help shop owners manage their emails, track sales, and automate boring tasks. The night I uploaded my program online, I remember sitting back in my chair, heart pounding, knowing no one in the house would understand what I had just done. I priced the tool at $19 a month because it felt reasonable and because I honestly doubted anyone would buy it. But 2 people signed up within the first week. I stared at my screen as the notification came through, $19, and I froze. It was such a small amount to anyone else, but to me, it felt like the universe had opened a secret door and whispered, "Come in." That first sale changed me. It wasn't about the money yet. It was the validation. A stranger thought what I built had value. A stranger believed in something I created, something my own family never showed interest in. I remember sitting cross-legged on my bed and staring at that tiny number until tears blurred the screen. It was proof that I wasn't invisible. I listened to my users carefully. One woman from Denver, Colorado, named Sophie, sent me a message saying, "This saves me so much time." You should charge more. I read that line 100 times. No one had ever told me that my work was worth more. So I raised the price. First to $39, then $59, then $99. And the astonishing part was that the sign-ups kept coming. Soon shops in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles were using it. Then shops from London and other cities in Europe found it, too. It spread quietly, like a secret whispered behind doors. I didn't tell anyone in my family. Not because I wanted to hide it then, but because I already knew what they would say. My mother would scoff at the idea that anyone paid for a little computer trick. My father would remind me that real jobs required real credentials. Emily would smirk. Lucas would shrug. So I stayed silent, building my world alone. When my revenue hit 6 figures, I realized I needed help with the legal and financial side. I contacted a lawyer named Marcus King in Austin, Texas, who had helped other small tech founders. When I showed up in his office, he looked genuinely confused. He thought he'd be meeting someone older. When he asked for my ID and realized I was barely 20, he raised an eyebrow but didn't question the numbers. The numbers spoke for themselves. He helped me file paperwork to create Parker Systems LLC, and when he finished, he leaned back and said, "You know you're sitting on something huge, right?" I didn't answer because the truth was I didn't know. I was too afraid to assume anything. By the time I turned 21, my software crossed $1 million in yearly sales. I saw the number appear in my accounting software one morning while sitting in the tiny apartment I had rented in Cleveland, and I put my hand over my mouth because I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. No one else knew. Not Emily. Not Lucas. Not my parents. They still talked about me as if I were drifting through life without ambition. They still compared me to Emily's steady path or Lucas's future potential. When I hit $50 million in profit at age 23, it no longer felt like luck. It felt like destiny. It felt like everything I had built in secret was finally breaking through the surface. But with the success came fear. Not of failure, but of my family finding out. I knew them too well. I had grown up hearing my father say, "If any of you ever hit it big, remember your parents. We raised you. We deserve something back." The way he said it never sounded like love. It sounded like a warning, a claim on a future that didn't belong to him. I remembered the moments when they had dismissed me, mocked me, and treated my dreams as meaningless. I knew that if they discovered the money, the company, or even the house I now lived in, they would try to control me. And I wasn't going to let that happen. So I started creating layers, legal layers, financial layers, protective layers. I opened holding companies in different states across America. I put assets into trusts. I diversified accounts in New York and San Francisco. I bought a modern glass house on a hill outside San Diego, California, but not under my personal name. It belonged to one of the companies. I learned how to move quietly, how to protect what I built, and how to make sure that my success stayed mine. By the time I turned 25, my net worth had quietly risen above $400 million. And still, my family had no idea. To them, I was still the lost daughter who played with computers. The irony made me smile sometimes. Other times, it made me sad. Not because they didn't know, but because they had never cared enough to ask. Every so often, late at night, I would think about telling them the truth. But then I would hear my mother's voice in my memory saying, "You'll never make real money with that silly coding." And the anger would return. Not the kind that burned, but the kind that clarified. The kind that reminded me why I built a second life they would never be able to claim. So, I kept the $400 million hidden, not out of spite, but out of self-protection. It wasn't the money I was hiding. It was my freedom. My parents had moved to Houston, Texas 2 years before the gathering that changed everything. They loved telling anyone who would listen that it was a new chapter, though what they really meant was that the house was bigger and the neighbors were more likely to ask about salaries. The new place had white pillars, a wide driveway, and a front lawn that looked like it had been stolen from a magazine cover. The way my parents bragged about it, you would think they had built it brick by brick with their own hands instead of financing it through loans. To them, it was proof they had climbed some invisible American ladder. When they invited me to a family dinner there, I hesitated. Part of me hoped things might feel different in the new house, that somehow distance and time had softened them. But deep down, I already knew the answer. I still went, maybe out of habit, maybe out of a lingering hope that they would finally see me as a person instead of a disappointment. I booked a room in a hotel near downtown Houston instead of staying with them. When they asked why, I blamed it on work calls. The truth was simpler. I didn't want to feel trapped under their roof again. I arrived at the house early in the evening. My mother opened the door, wearing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She hugged me quickly, like she was posing for a camera rather than greeting her daughter. My father approached next, giving me one of those stiff pats on the shoulder he used to give coaches or coworkers he didn't actually like. He looked me up and down and said, "So, still playing with your little programs?" The word playing hit me like a slap, but I swallowed the sting and walked inside. Lucas was already in the living room, talking loudly about his business classes in Boston and how he planned to get a job that paid at least 6 figures right away. Emily sat next to him with her husband William, the finance guy from New York City, who seemed to speak only in market terms. My parents adored him. They never understood a word he said, but they loved that he sounded important. To them, everyone had a neat label. Emily was the responsible one, Lucas was the future businessman, and I was the lost child, the one who drifted from one idea to another like a stray balloon that never stayed in place. We sat down at the long dining table, the kind that was meant to impress rather than feed. My mother fussed over the dishes, reminding everyone how much the set cost, as if the price tag made the meal taste better. Once we started eating, the conversation quickly turned into a performance. My mother began with, "Lucas is doing so well. His professors say he's top of his class." Then she glanced at me and added, "That's what a real future looks like." I smiled politely and cut my food into smaller pieces, pretending her words were harmless. But my father couldn't resist joining in. "So, Janice," he said, leaning back in his chair, "do you have a proper job yet? Or are you still, what do you call it, freelancing?" I replied, "I run my own software company." He laughed. It was loud, sharp, and completely dismissive. Everyone else followed his lead with subtle smirks, the kind people wear when they think they're being polite. "A company?" my mother said, shaking her head. "Janice, please. Don't embarrass yourself. You can be honest with your family." The room felt like it was closing in on me, each comment pulling the walls tighter. Lucas snorted into his drink. Emily looked at her plate, but the small smile on her lips said enough. I sat there quietly, feeling anger begin to brew in the deepest part of me. Not the explosive kind, but the cold, slow kind that makes everything painfully clear. I said softly, "You have no idea what I do. You've never asked. You've only judged." My father rolled his eyes dramatically, the way he always did when I strayed from the script he expected. "Don't start with your drama," he said. "You live in some tiny apartment, right? You can't even help with the family expenses. If you had anything real going on, you'd have proved it by now." He had no clue I could have paid off their house, bought the house next to it, and still had enough left to buy a mansion in San Diego. He had no idea that the chair he was sitting on was worth less than what I made in a single minute. But they never cared to ask. They only cared to measure. Then my mother said the line that shattered whatever thread was left between us. "We worry about you, Janice. You're almost 30 and still a burden. We raised a loser." "I'm just being honest." A silence fell across the table. Even Lucas stopped smirking. They stared at me, expecting tears, or maybe an apology. My heart was pounding, but my voice came out strangely calm. I placed my napkin neatly on the table and stood up. "I'm not a burden," I said. "I'm not a loser. And I'm not your problem anymore." My mother frowned. "Sit down, don't cause a scene." "No," I said. "I'm done." I walked out of the dining room, past the polished staircase and the overpriced chandelier. As I stepped outside, the warm Houston air wrapped around me like freedom. I got into my rented car and drove back to the hotel. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just felt an overwhelming clarity, the kind that comes when you finally stop pretending. In the hotel room, I packed my bag in silence. I booked the earliest flight back to San Diego, where my glass house waited, my real home, built with my effort, my ideas, and my independence. The next morning, as the plane lifted off, I looked down at the vast spread of America beneath me. My chest felt light, almost hollow, but not in a painful way. It was the kind of hollow you feel when something heavy has finally been removed. They think I'll crawl back, I whispered to myself. They think I need them. They have no idea who I am. And for the first time in my life, I realized they never would. 2 years after I walked out of my parents' house in Houston, I found myself sitting in the sunlit living room of my glass house overlooking the hills of San Diego, California. The Pacific stretched out in front of me like a calm blue promise, the kind I had never been given growing up. The walls were mostly windows, and when I opened them, the air smelled of salt, warmth, and freedom. It was the first place I had ever lived that felt completely mine, paid for by my mind, not my family's expectations. By then, my company had grown in ways I never could have predicted when I was 19, sitting in my tiny bedroom in Cleveland. I had teams in Miami, Seattle, and Dallas, each one filled with people who believed in the product and in me. Our software was being used by thousands of businesses across America and throughout Europe, and every month the numbers climbed higher. Investors sent emails asking for meetings. Journalists wanted quotes. It seemed like everyone suddenly wanted a piece of the story I had built in secret. My net worth had crossed $400 million, carefully spread across companies, trusts, and diversified investments. I had learned how to build not only software but protection, legal walls, financial structures, and distance from anything or anyone that could threaten what I had created. Everything was clean, solid, and mine. I no longer worried about someone taking it away, not even my own family. One afternoon, as I sat reviewing a contract from a partner in London, my assistant forwarded me an email. A well-known business channel in New York City wanted to interview me as one of America's youngest self-made millionaires in tech. The host, Claire Jensen, was known for interviewing industry giants. She had spoken to founders whose names appeared in magazines and on Forbes lists. Now she wanted me. I said yes. 2 weeks later, I flew to New York. I arrived at the studio wearing a simple black dress and white sneakers. No designer labels, no flashy accessories. I didn't need clothes to speak for me anymore. Claire greeted me with a warm smile as her team set up lights around us. She had a calm presence, the kind that made people want to tell the truth. You know, she said just before we went live, most people your age aren't sitting on hundreds of millions of dollars. You must have some story. I returned her smile and said, "Oh, I do." Then the red light on the camera blinked on. Claire turned toward the lens and introduced me with a confidence that surprised me. Tonight we have Janice Parker, founder of Parker Systems, one of the fastest-growing software companies in America. At 27, she's already worth over $400 million. For a moment, I imagined my parents sitting in their living room in Houston, watching the interview the way they watched all shows about successful people. My father loved tech segments and interviews with rich entrepreneurs. He respected strangers on TV more than he had ever respected me. Claire asked about my beginnings, my product, and my growth. Then she leaned forward and asked a question I knew was coming. What was your childhood like? Did your family support your journey? I took a breath and looked directly at the camera, not at Claire, not at the audience, but at the version of myself who once sat in a small room in Dayton, hunched over a cracked laptop. I grew up in a place where I was often told I would never be anything, I said. I was called a burden, a loser, but I found a laptop and I found code, and I built something anyway. Claire softened. Did your family support you? No, I said, keeping my voice even. They didn't. But sometimes, lack of support becomes fuel. I learned to trust myself when no one else did. The interview continued with talk of product lines, hiring strategies, and my decision to invest in young women entering tech. I spoke about offering grants in dollars, not as charity but as belief. It felt empowering to talk about giving others what I had never been given. When the interview ended, I returned to my hotel in Midtown. My phone vibrated nonstop. First messages from my team, celebrations, congratulations, screenshots of the broadcast. Then messages from investors. Then old classmates. And finally, the names I had expected to see eventually. Mom, Dad, Emily, Lucas. I didn't answer. They called again. And again. I set the phone face down and went to take a long shower. When I returned, my phone was covered in notifications. Dozens of messages waited, apologies, excuses, sudden affection that had never existed before. From my mother, Janice, we are so proud of you. Why didn't you tell us? You know we always believed in you. We made mistakes, but we're still your parents. Please call. From my father, we're family. You owe us at least a talk. You know we struggled raising you. We deserve something back. Let's forget the past and move forward. You can help us with a few things. A few things. I knew exactly what that meant. Money, houses, status, whatever made them look good. I sat on the bed, breathing slowly, letting the emotions settle. Then I began typing. You called me a loser. You told me I was a burden. You mocked my work. You dismissed my dreams. And now that you've seen me on TV, suddenly I have value to you. I remember everything. I am not your backup plan. I owe you nothing. I sent similar messages to Emily and Lucas, reminding them how they had played along, how they had laughed when my parents belittled me. Then I blocked them all. Back in San Diego, I walked through my quiet house, sunlight pouring across the floor, and I felt something I had never felt before. Peace. Real, deep, earned peace. This house, this life, this freedom, they weren't gifts. They were built from every moment I refused to break. And for the first time, standing on that hill in America, I felt truly, completely home.